photosynthesis, probably one of the more important processes out there, as it provides food, which gives us energy, and without that we really won't be able to accomplish much. Now, the process of photosynthesis is a little bit more complicated than what we are going to look at now. If you are going to further your studies, and you're probably going, if you're going to study something like botany, you'll see that there is a bit more to this process than what we are going to do now. But once again, it is a basic explanation of photosynthesis, so don't get too worried. Looking at the definition of photosynthesis, you will see that it is basically this chemical equation just put into words. So if you are able to recall this chemical equation, you'll be able to write down the definition of photosynthesis. So during the process of photosynthesis, plants want to produce carbohydrates. That is the food that they are going to use. And that food is then in the form of glucose. Glucose is a carbohydrate, if you recall from grade 10 work that you have done. So glucose is then produced. That is the main thing that plants want. They want food. But as this reaction takes place, oxygen is formed as a byproduct. It just happens to form, and that gets released into the atmosphere, which is great for us. So this is formed when we combine carbon dioxide and water using energy from the sun. So radiant energy from the sun. We need energy to put all of these reactants together so that we can get to the products. And this can only happen in the presence of green plants, so plants that contain chlorophyll, the pigment that gives plants that green color. And then there are also enzymes involved, and we'll look at these enzymes in a bit more detail later on in the video. Now, looking at this chemical equation, this is not a balanced chemical equation, so if you have physics, you will know that equations have to be balanced. This is just a very basic explanation. So everything to the left of the arrow will be known as the reactants. So they have to react in order to give us, this tablet is not working with me today, products. So everything to the right of the arrow are the products. That is what is formed. So carbon dioxide and water are combined in the presence of radiant energy from the sun, chlorophyll and enzymes to produce glucose, C6, H12O6, and then oxygen is produced as a byproduct. So the requirements for photosynthesis, everything to the left, carbon dioxide, water, radiant energy, chlorophyll and enzymes, and then what is produced, glucose, that will eventually be stored as starch, any excess glucose that is not used immediately, and those are carbohydrates, and then oxygen is then released into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis takes place in a certain part of plants, and the part of the plant where photosynthesis takes place is in the chloroplast, which is an organelle found inside plant cells. Now, in grade 10, you would have studied some of these organelles and their functions, and you would have had to draw quite a few of them, and you will have to do that once again with photosynthesis and be able to draw a general structure of a chloroplast. So looking at the structure of a chloroplast, it's really not that hard. You've got a double membrane, so it's got an outer membrane, an inner membrane, that's that lighter green section over here. Then you've also got the fluid-filled area of the chloroplast, which is known as the stroma. And then the very important parts of the chloroplast are these little stacked, they almost look like little stacked Smarties, the thylakoids. So one of these discs is known as a thylakoid, and together they are known as a granum, singular, and then plural, if you count all of these individual stacks, is then grana. Now inside these grana is the very important plastid called chlorophyll, which is necessary for photosynthesis to occur in. Now there are also other structures that you will find in the chloroplast, such as ribosomes that are scattered throughout the chloroplast, mitochondria, and then these starch granules. So there is a bit more to it. You've got the diagrams in your notes, in your textbooks, so just refer to those ones. This is just a very basic diagram. Now, photosynthesis, getting to the process itself, it occurs in two phases, the light phase and then the dark phase. Now, the dark phase can be a bit confusing when you look at the name, but we'll look at that in just a bit. So the light phase, it takes place in the presence of light. So this phase, you can also say, is light dependent. It is dependent on light for it to be able to take place. And then the dark phase, it takes place in light or darkness. And that is why it's called the dark phase, because it does not need light. It is not dependent on light, so you can also say it is light independent. I prefer if you use light independent and light dependent than light phase or dark phase, just because it can get a bit confusing because they say dark phase, but it can take place during the day or without light being present, so nighttime as well. Can take place in both those times. Now, looking at the light phase, it takes place in the grana of the chloroplast, so in these little stacks over here. And the main reason it takes place there is because of the presence of chlorophyll in the thylakoids. So the chlorophyll molecules in the thylakoids absorb the radiant energy from the sun coming in, and they are responsible for converting that radiant energy into chemical energy. Remember, energy is never lost, it is just changed into a different type of energy. So what is chemical energy used for? It is used in the process of photolysis, which is when we split water into energy-rich hydrogen atoms. So we are going to do that, splitting the oxygen from the hydrogens, and then it is also used in the formation of ATP. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's an energy carrier, basically, that is found in cells. Looking at the dark phase, it is also known as the Kelvin cycle, very important. They might not refer to the dark phase, they might just say Kelvin cycle, and then you know what it is. So this takes place in the stroma of the chloroplast, so the fluid-filled area, the stroma. And carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is combined with the energy-rich hydrogen atoms using the energy from ATP, formed in the light phase, and then glucose is formed, and then the excess is stored as starch. So if you recall the chemical equation of photosynthesis, you will see that we're going to use each one of these reactants at different stages, and then we'll be forming the products at different stages. For example, oxygen is formed during the light phase, and then glucose is formed during the dark phase. And then we'll also be using water during the light phase and carbon dioxide during the dark phase. Now, looking at what we just read, let's look at this diagram. Hopefully it'll explain it a bit better. So this yellow structure is the chloroplast. So we're just looking at the different processes within the chloroplast. So let's look at the light phase first, obviously classified with the presence of light. It is the light reactions. So this takes place where? In the grana of the chloroplast, which you can see the thylakoids stacked here, and inside them is chlorophyll that is necessary for converting that radiant energy into chemical energy. So what happens is we've got water that is being sucked up from the roots of the plant, and that finally reaches the chloroplast. Then light energy from the sun, all of this goes into the grana, and there's a reaction that occurs. What's going to happen is water is going to be split using that radiant energy, and we're going to have very energy rich hydrogen atoms being released. And because that was released, we now have oxygen that is produced as a byproduct, and then that leaves the plant through the stomata and goes out into the atmosphere. I'm sure you guys recall what a stomata is, as we've been doing that since grade 8. So now we need a way for this energy-rich hydrogen atom to go over to the dark phase, into the stroma. It needs to be carried over there because it cannot do it itself. And that is where the enzymes now come in. There's an enzyme known as NADP. And NADP functions as a taxi. It is the carrier that will assist us to get these energy-rich hydrogen atoms going across. So the energy-rich hydrogen atoms bind to this enzyme, and now it is NADPH, and that is happening over here. It's going to take the hydrogen across to the Calvin cycle that occurs in the stroma. But we also need energy. Now, during this whole process, there is an energy carrier known as ATP. Now I've got this diagram on the left that will show what happens. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So tri means 3, so we've got 3 phosphates that are bound together. Now at this one phosphate, between the 2 phosphate bonds there is basically a lot of energy between these 2 bonds, and that is the energy which we are going to use, and that is then carried across to the Calvin cycle. So what's going to happen in the Calvin cycle, we've now got carbon dioxide coming in from the atmosphere, and that's now going to enter the stroma. What we need to do is we need to get this hydrogen to combine with the carbon dioxide so that we can produce sugar, glucose, and that happens using the energy of ATP, because we need energy to get this reaction going. So what is going to happen is one of these phosphates on the left here, the third one basically, it's going to break off, and when that breaks off, all of that energy that is in between these 2 with the bond they have is going to be released. That energy is then used to combine the carbon dioxide into the hydrogen. And basically, a basic explanation, you don't need to know this, is that we will have something like this that is formed. Don't worry if you don't have physics, because this might be a bit complicated. So this is what a carbohydrate looks like, and that is what we are going to get formed. And that N basically stands for, you can substitute any amount. In this case, we would substitute a 6 in there, because we know that C6H12O6 is glucose. So then we have the sugar that is formed. Now it's not yet the glucose that we need. You don't need to know that. You just need to know that in the end it is glucose that is produced. But in actual fact, it's something called, you can abbreviate it using that. It's glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate that is formed, and that will then be transformed into glucose. But don't worry, you don't need to know that. You just need to know that glucose is formed. So we now have used the ATP. That ATP then becomes ADP plus a phosphate group, because it's now adenosine diphosphate. There's only 2 phosphates looking at this diagram. Because we've broken one off, we now have ADP. But this has to go back, because this is a cycle, remember? So this ADP is going to go back, as well as the NADP plus, which has now dropped that hydrogen, is also going to go back to the light phase, so that it can assist with the next reaction to take place. So how does that ADP now again become ATP? Well, once again, with energy, it takes that third phosphate and it binds it to the adenosine diphosphate, and we then get ATP, and this whole thing just carries on again. And NADP just goes back, so it can be a taxi again for the attachment of that hydrogen atom. So just before I carry on to the next work, have we checked everything? Have we used everything? Carbon dioxide, yes, that was used in the dark phase. Water, yes, that was used in the light phase. Did we produce glucose? Yes, in the end of the Calvin cycle we produced glucose, and then yes, we also produced oxygen during the light phase. Let's look at the importance of photosynthesis. So why is photosynthesis important for our daily lives? It keeps the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere and water constant, because without the process of photosynthesis we won't have oxygen that is produced as a byproduct, which means that we won't have any oxygen to breathe. It will also keep the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and water constant. So remember the process of photosynthesis, one of the requirements is carbon dioxide for it to occur. It provides food for all heterotrophic organisms. We are also heterotrophs. We cannot produce our own food like plants, which are autotrophs. So we need photosynthesis in order to survive. And then it also makes chemical energy available for cell function. So you need to know the importance of photosynthesis. Next, we'll be looking at factors that influence the rate of photosynthesis. There's 3 of them that we'll be looking at. So these factors are light intensity, carbon dioxide, the concentration of carbon dioxide, and then temperature. So looking at light intensity, that is the amount of light that is coming down on a plant. So if we increase the light intensity, this can also result in an increase in the rate of photosynthesis. But everything has an optimal amount that works best. As soon as you pass that optimal amount, something it's going to inhibit the process from occurring as properly as it should, and it then will slow the process down. So in this case, if light intensity becomes too high, the stomata of the plant will close, which means that there's no carbon dioxide coming into the plant anymore, which is a requirement for photosynthesis, and carbon dioxide then becomes a limiting factor. Now, what is a limiting factor? In biology, it refers to any of the factors or variables in an environment capable of limiting a process. Because there's no carbon dioxide coming in, it is a requirement. That means that photosynthesis can't take place. So you'll see as the light intensity increases on this graph, you'll see that the rate of photosynthesis will go up until it reaches a point or a plateau where there's too much light, which means that the rate of photosynthesis will start evening out. If the light intensity increases a lot more, you'll even start to see a plunge in the rate of photosynthesis, because the stomata have closed, which means that there's no longer carbon dioxide coming in. Looking at the next factor, it is temperature. So plants photosynthesize best at 25 degrees Celsius. That is the optimum temperature that they have. Anything lower than that, it will affect the enzymes. They become inactive, and one of the enzymes we know that has to function during this process is NADP. So that will become inactive. Anything higher, much higher, if you start going to 30 plus degrees Celsius, enzymes will start to denature. Remember, enzymes also, if you remember from grade 10 work, have an optimum temperature at which they function. At high temperatures, once again, so if it becomes too hot, once again the stomata will close, and that means that carbon dioxide will become a limiting factor. So looking at this diagram, this will indicate the increase in temperature to the right. So as we're going up, 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 this will probably be 25 degrees Celsius in that temperature range, and as soon as it becomes hotter than that, you'll see that there's a decrease in the rate of photosynthesis. The next factor is carbon dioxide. So when carbon dioxide is the limiting factor, it leads to a decrease in the rate of photosynthesis, but then also an increase will lead to an increase in the rate of photosynthesis. Remember, if it's the limiting factor, if there's more of it, it means the plant can photosynthesize more because it is a requirement for photosynthesis to take place. Now, there are a few experiments. I won't be looking at the experiments in this video. It's going to take too long. We use the Answer Series book series. So in the grade 11 one, Life Sciences, the experiments are on page 2.4 up until 2.6. They have asked quite a few of these experiments in previous papers, so just go have a look at that. And then just looking at this diagram, as the carbon dioxide concentration increases, you'll see that there's an increase in the rate of photosynthesis. But as my mom always says, too much of a good thing is not always good. So if you have too much carbon dioxide, eventually you will see that there's also a plateau that occurs, and the plant won't photosynthesize as efficiently as it would have. I'm sure most of you know what a greenhouse looks like. My grandfather had one growing up, and I liked playing in it for some reason. But greenhouses play a very important role in agriculture and growing plants. And that is because greenhouses actually enable us to grow plants all year round, even in the coldest conditions, because it is a very regulated environment. Now, looking at the role of these optimum factors, so we're once again going to look at the light intensity, temperature, and carbon dioxide. Now, in greenhouses, they provide optimum factors so that plants can grow optimally. Now, looking at light intensity, it accelerates photosynthesis and the growth of the plant. Greenhouses must allow the maximum amount of light in, so you'll see that they are transparent so that light can come into them, because without light we don't have that energy to convert or to combine the water and the carbon dioxide. And then you'll see that very serious people will have something called a photometer, and that just measures the amount of light coming in, and this is what it looks like, in case you were just wondering. You'll see that if you are interested in movies, you'll see that, or photography, these types of devices are also used to measure the amount of light so that settings can be made to the camera. Then the second one is optimum temperature. Remember, plants grow optimally at a temperature of around 25 degrees Celsius, so in a greenhouse that is regulated, and it allows for growth all year long. So in greenhouses, this is a very basic greenhouse. You'll generally see that they have flaps or basically openings, and this helps to regulate the temperature, because believe me, in here it can get quite hot. So if it gets too hot, there'll be thermometers usually inside the greenhouse that will indicate the temperature. The person running the greenhouse will just open the flap so that some of the air can escape, and in some of the more fancier greenhouses, they'll even have these flaps at the top that can open. Remember, warm air rises, cold air goes to the bottom, so the warm air can escape. Some of them will even have like air regulation systems, like an air conditioner type system that will control the temperature of the greenhouse in there. Very big greenhouses, they have all of these very sensitive sensors in them that is displayed on computer screens, and these days people can just regulate the circumstances of the greenhouse from their computer in an office. Carbon dioxide, the next one, So since it is a closed system, carbon dioxide needs to be regulated in a greenhouse because it can't enter by itself. So plants use carbon dioxide during the day, and it can become a limiting factor if the plants use up all of the carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide can be regulated by using carbon dioxide tanks like here. People can use them to pump in carbon dioxide into these greenhouses, but then also you've got more natural ways of getting carbon dioxide in by using organic materials and then decomposition bacteria that will also release carbon dioxide into the greenhouse to be able to regulate that. And that is the end of this video. As you see, it's really not that bad. I think the worst part is this diagram over here, but if you go through your theory and you look at this diagram, it'll start making sense in the end.